Morning all. We haven't gone through a positional queen sacrifice game in a while since the classic Nesmetanov-Chernikov game on the channel. Let's have a look at another type of game which has such a sacrifice, which you may not have seen before. Gusev versus Averbakh in the Moscow Championship of 1946. I hope that doesn't remind you vividly of the game in question. Okay, e4 and from Gusev, Averbakh played the Sicilian, and we see actually the start of the Sicilian dragon variation because black plays g6. White doesn't go for castling queenside. Instead, he's got an aggressive plan still, but castling kingside and making use of the rook, which is automatically put on f1. Quite aggressively, you'll see that to make use of this rook, just playing f4 and then now here f5, gaining space and bolstering that f5 pawn with g4, now threatening also g5, which would allow knight d5, and then pushing forward maybe with f6 would be a threat. So white's playing very, very aggressively so far. Knight e5, and white carries on, just g5 and knight d5. It looks quite natural. It's space gaining, squeeze black, congest all the pieces, congest development. Black reacts here with f6, trying to undermine white's pawn on g5 and stop white from playing f6. White just continues bishop e3 and is even eyeing a7 here. So does black have to do something about that? Well, if he loses a7, then b6 is weaker. So he plays b6, and it doesn't look like a very healthy position to have with the black pieces. Knight d4 threatens now all sorts of things, but mainly knight e6 would add to black's congestion woes here. It would potentially lock in some more of black's pieces, and that light square bishop could be quite valuable. Black plays here king f7, believe it or not. So maybe one of the ideas is to try and break this rook out, like with h6 at some point. Well, it simply plays c3, and that has a few implications, like queen b3. This diagonal might be sensitive. So black is in real difficulties here. He plays queen e8, and white plays now knight e6, not minding the king being able to come out and win a pawn, it seems. But that would be far too dangerous, surely. In fact, after bishop takes e6, f takes, black didn't venture out here with king takes e6. He put his king on f8, but we're still left with this horrendous lack of development. Okay, this is sometimes what makes an instructive game. You see an issue like this, and you wonder how can it be punished? Well, we're going to see something quite spectacular now. The first in the spectacular fireworks display on the chessboard is knight takes f6. Okay, here it's clear that e takes doesn't look so straightforward because of queen takes d6 check, but black plays instead knight takes f6, and after g takes plays bishop takes f6. But there's a huge problem now. This rook is about to become a prisoner after bishop h6 check. This bishop's now pinned. The king is imprisoning its own rook, and this isn't very healthy. And this fact is now wonderfully exploited. White plays in this position, rook takes f6. Okay, and it looks like, okay, an exchange sack. Very, very justified because black is playing like a rook down here. And now black, okay, he plays on, even though his position looks very miserable. Because how does white actually, break through? Okay, so he plays on with rook c6. And now, if I give you 20 seconds, can you spot white's next move? So white to play, 20 seconds starting from now. Okay, if you guess this move, give yourself 20 points. If you guess all the reasons behind the move, give yourself 2,000 points, because the reason's more important than guessing the next move. The reasoning behind this, it's absolutely wonderful. Queen takes e5, positional queen sack. Now we're not talking the Nesmetanov huge knight on d5 scenario, we're talking rook imprisonment on h8 and how that's kind of exploited here, along with this diagonal. So these are the tactical trump cards white has. So we see f takes e, not much choice there, and now we start to see the real impact after rook f1. So what is going on here, you might ask? Well, if queen takes e6, rook f8 is mate. Just to show you. Okay, so if rook takes e6, there would seem to be a nasty pin here, which would make the threat of bishop takes e6 very, very unpleasant to deal with, because black is a rook down. What does he do here? You know, he's still going to get mated with this rook f8 idea. Right, so it is a tricky position. So in this position, black tried rook c8, and now we see some quieter type moves, still nonetheless very, very effective. So this is a bit harder in many ways to spot than the previous guessed move. Can you guess what white plays here if I give you 20 seconds, or 10 seconds rather, starting from now? Okay, white plays bishop d1, just trying to get onto that sensitive diagonal, with a huge threat then of e7, which would be mating in a different way, you know, queen f7, bishop f7 mating. So black tries to sort of block that diagonal, plays rook c4, and we see bishop b3 and the blockage of that diagonal with b5. But we really see now two black major pieces prisoners, because white in this position simply takes that rook. Okay, and you might think, well, hang on, e7 doesn't work here because you can play queen takes, and where is white's attack? So how does white finish off this game? Funny enough, you know, black is actually defenseless here if white can increase an advantage of some form or another, and it's not necessarily having to be using the king. He has to use the pawns here, because these are optimally placed to lock in these two guys. They're optimally placed. If black ever plays, you know, g5 trying to break out, there's always rook f8, so the queen really has to stand guard of f8 here. Can you guess what white played here, using some other of the major assets in the position? If I give you 10 seconds now. Okay, it's a bit sadistic really. Sadism on the chessboard. b3, and there's an implication that this pawn is just going to take and wander up the board, and when it gets to about there, it's going to start to cause trouble for other threats, like rook f8 check takes, and this pawn might be queening then. So black tries a5, and we see b takes c4, and the queen waiting now with queen e7. But no, if c5 it's going to be check, so white moves his king away, preparing c5, and black is still helpless. The bishop's thankfully covering for white g5. So black tries queen a3, still maintaining guard of f8, and we simply see rook f2 here. So where can the black queen go now? Well, he puts it back on e7, and it looks as though, yes, c5, it looks as though c5 has been prevented in this position. White plays now rook f1, maybe with another idea on the cards. So let's see, what other idea could be on the cards? Well, potentially rook b1 is always going to unimprison these guys. So maybe he hasn't got an immediate intention, but he's waiting to see what black could do here before working it all out. Black actually plays, in this position, g5. We'll do a critical inspection of these positions in the second pass through the game with an engine to see if black had any resources. So g5 was played, which of course creates a weakness of the last move, this f5 square. White goes in with rook f5 actually now. Now we see g4, and here is where white decides, in this position, Now that he's got rook g5 resource and this pawn is covering f7, guess what white can play now, rather sadistically, in this position, which doesn't make black's idea of g5 look that clever. So white to play here, 10 seconds. Okay, white can now play c5, because if queen takes, then there's rook g5 mate. This is a new resource, all created from black's g5, which is why we need to look at this game again to see, really, is this really the case? Did this really have to happen if black didn't play g5? So c5 is now implemented safely. Black is helpless. Queen d8. He's not even threatening queen d2 check here because the bishop's covering d2. White simply carries on with c6. And after queen e7, now just c7, because again we have this idea, well, if the queen takes, of either rook f8 or rook g5. So the queen's totally helpless here, and black finally resigns. Easiest is just playing for the rook g5 in this position, and then queening just rook g5 if the queen ever comes off g5. Okay, let's have a look at this game again to see, really, do the engines like this game? Let's just check. So we go to the critical position. So white played very, very aggressively, just casting kingside against this line and playing for this space squeezing on the kingside. White is already, I believe, technically much better, but it doesn't look as though it's that much. It's less than half a pawn, to be fair, on this, technically. Okay, but it starts going a bit downhill for black. After b6 looks like a major mistake from an engine perspective because of knight d4. So what should black have played here? Apparently f takes g5. It's giving that up. Knight c4, and it might have been a slightly different story to the game. Allowing bishop b6 is not as bad, maybe, as the game continuation, but still white seems better. Bishop d4 here, and white seems better anyway. But it seems b6 gives a much bigger advantage now, with c3 given as a very strong move, in fact, in this position, making use of that diagonal for the king. Knight e6, okay, takes. So if king takes e6, queen b3 is very destructive. Let's have a quick look at that. So say king d7, check. Now bishop d1 again. This idea of the bishop coming to the diagonal is strong. Knight takes f6, and we have quite a devastating position apparently. So let's go back here. So the king went to f8, and we saw knight takes f6. And now what does the engines think of this continuation here? It seems even black is given here as though black is slightly better after rook c6. So depth, unbelievably, 16. Let's show you this. It's given as though, you will not believe this, black, as though black is better here. So is this queen takes e5? This is depth 19 with Houdini. Is queen takes e5 unsound? It's not being mentioned. Depth 20. Now we might need to give this some time. If this really is sound, it's a profoundly deep, well, from an engine point of view, it seems to be a very tricky queen sack to spot. I think we can observe the logical consequences of imprisonment of black pieces as humans, but the engine is not finding, believe it or not, queen takes e5 here at depth 21. So it's giving a continuation of the queen retreating and black playing rook takes e6. Once that happens, black will have the f7 square to bring the king out, and then this rook will be activated. So white's move really imprisons the rook. Now, let's be fair though. Objectively, the engine might be ruling out the queen takes e5 because it might have some element of unsoundness which wasn't picked up during the game. So let's have a look. It might have ruled it out because of some amazing black counter resource. So we're not getting anywhere on depth 21 to find this queen takes e5. So queen takes e5, let's put it in, and it looks as though black's hugely better with f takes e5, and now we see rook f1, and black's resource, which it's giving as a winning resource, well, is either what was played, rook c8, is better, or rook c7. Let's go with the game continuation for a moment. Rook c8, and we have bishop d1, and again it looks as though black's better in the game continuation with this barricade. And here, depth 16, depth 17, all of a sudden it's equal now. That -2 has disappeared, but we still have the fundamental logic which isn't going away, that the black rook is a prisoner. So after taking, I think the engine's going to start changing its tune now. b3, no, it still likes black. Now it's changing its tune to about equal. Again, about equal. I think it's confusing the heck out of it. And now we see a big advantage for white there. Immediately, it's finding a big advantage now. So what a change of tune in this position. Just from black playing queen e7. So the question is, can black have actually held this position? No, now even queen c8 is ruled out as huge for white. So this is quite remarkable. I didn't actually anticipate this engine inspection. So if we go back to this move, queen takes e5. Let's go with what the engine thought was much better than the game continuation. And now it's not finding much difference. Rook c7 or rook c8. So it's actually preferring the game continuation, rook c8. So is this actually, dare we say it sounds, now it's dead zero. I mean, logically as humans we look at this and we think, how does black get out of this? If black takes on e6, then bishop b3, and we get the basic decoy. If rook c4, we get the decoy for rook f8. And in this continuation, queen takes b3 looks like a radical approach mentioned here, as though this would be equal. But really, is it? With that rook trapped in? Again, this is a very difficult position, I think, for engines to assess. And now it looks as though white's better. +3 now. Because what is black doing? Black is helpless. That is the status of black's position with the king and rook like this. Remarkable, really. It's to do with horizon effect. So let's go back here. So queen takes e5. Even though there's this claim black's apparently better. But how? So rook c8, we see -2 again. And we see black now is equal. And now we just drift into this lost position where again black's helpless and white's just winning here. If c takes b3, let's have a quick look at c takes b3, g5 say. There's always rook f5 here. So if we can't do g5, let's do queen e7, and it's again a state of waiting now. Let's just wait around here to see what white can do. +10. You see this queen c8 is now a +10 because of c4. There's a passed pawn being generated here slowly on the queen side. Again, with black helpless. If black carries on like this, then this pawn's coming up here to just c7. Anything now. And that's forcing g5. If queen e8, we in this position, in this critical position, we can either queen the pawn or we can play e7. So e7 apparently stronger. So and then that, of course, rook f8 is now supported by the pawn. So you can't do this because of rook f8. And if queen takes e7, we just queen our c pawn. So completely underestimated queen sack from Engines. So I challenge everyone on YouTube. Do you think this is unsound, this position, this queen takes e5? I challenge you from the perspective of examining logical game, the status, how that can possibly change. You know, like a Facebook status, what is black's position status? Rook can't move. The rook's never going to be able to move from h8. The queen's always going to have to look at the f8 square in this game continuation. So here, rook e6, there's bishop c4. The bishop's coming to that critical diagonal to get rid of black's very important rook resource. And now we're still left with this, unfortunately for black, a 3-2 pawn majority, able to generate a passed pawn. Black's tries to sack a pawn to keep the dark square blockade. But still, now if he didn't play g5 here, let's examine. If he didn't play g5 here, so with his double pawns in this scenario, okay, did white muck it up? Let's put the queen, I don't know, on e8. We just play c5. If we put the queen on c5, okay, how does this blockade broken? Now we see important resource rook f7, or even king h1. Let's take our pick. So if king h1, and let's put the queen back. Now we see c5 again as a pawn sack. Okay. So what's the idea? Again, rook f7 is the idea. So in this position, rook f7. What is going on here? Blimey. Can the queen actually escape from rook g7 and another check to pick up the queen? Where do we put the queen to avoid this? If we try the second move here, queen d6, that simply goes into it, doesn't it? King f8, rook d8, rook d7 rather, and pick up the queen. Bishop up. So where can the queen actually go here? Maybe this is the punchline, that the queen's lost here. a4 is no better. The queen is actually lost. Where can the queen go without actually being lost? Okay, a3. Let's go to a3, away from the glare of the rook because of that a5 pawn. And in this position, funny enough, the bishop is covering the critical c1 square. So we have rook d7, apparently, is the crushing move here. It is threatening rook d8 because that pawn is now part of the mating net of the rook and bishop. So queen f8 here is now clearly, I think, hopeless. You just take the queen. And e7 is a major threat on the cards. So what can black do here? There's no checks. You know, if he comes off, well, the threat is too much here. It's like only move time. You know, it's just totally hopeless. So that infiltration with rook f7. So even with the fractured pawns, c5 being used as a pawn sacrifice for rook f7. So I think there's enough evidence to indicate that even if I give you the PGN in the description, please check with your engines. It doesn't seem as though engines like queen takes e5. It's too deep. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.